Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's lecture on Latina feminist activism, where we once again focus on three particular women in history. We start with Luisa Moreno, who was born in Guatemala to a wealthy family in 1907. While in Guatemala, she fights for educational access for women and relinquishes her wealth and goes to Mexico, where she ends up working as a journalist. She arrives in New York during the Great Depression, where she works as a seamstress, and through that experience becomes inspired to organize her fellow workers into a union called La Liga de Costureras. As we saw in the reading, her life consisted of organizing workers throughout the United States. She helped organize cigar rollers in Florida, pecan shellers in Texas, and cannery workers in California. We also see how racial dynamics played a part in designating where she would be sent to organize workers, as her light skin was assumed to make her more amenable to the KKK, particularly in places like Florida, who would think twice before attacking her. So they actually used her white skin privilege as a way to, in some respects, infiltrate some labor areas where there was significant hostility towards people of color. She co-founded the Spanish-speaking People's Congress in 1939, which held the first Latino civil rights conference in the United States. She also organized around police brutality and supported the rights of immigrants. In the 1950s, with the rise of anti-communist sentiment, labor leaders like Luisa Moreno were considered a national threat and became a target for deportation. One of the things that is most recognized about her was her choice to relinquish her wealth, change her name, and affiliate herself with the working class instead of using her class and race privilege. As described in this quote, Moreno made strategic choices regarding her class and ethnic identification in order to facilitate her life's work as a labor and civil rights advocate. With her light skin, education, and unaccented English, she could have passed. Instead, she chose to forego any potential privileges predicated on race, class, or color. Moving on into the 1950s movements, we have Dolores Huerta, who was another labor organizer. She was born in 1930 and grew up among farm workers in California. She co-founded with Cesar Chavez the National Farm Workers Association, which later became the United Farm Workers. She successfully organized farm workers throughout California for decades, and she served as the key contract negotiator for the union. That was one of her primary roles for the union. And as the reading discussed, her very aggressive form of negotiating, something that was unexpected of a Mexican-American woman during that time, got her the nickname, the Dragon Lady. She was also a talented lobbyist for the United Farm Workers. She traveled to the state capitol in California, to DC, to lobby in favor of the union and in favor of farm workers' rights throughout the United States. There has also been anecdotal information about about her relationship with Cesar Chavez, right? That even though they worked together for decades, there were moments where there was tension between the two in terms of strategy and personality. Chavez, if you've seen any videos of him and so on, is often presented as kind of like the martyr, spiritual kind of leader, whereas Dolores Huerta was much more fierce in her presentation, vocal, unapologetic. And so they have very different styles. But also some of the tensions came from her dedicating herself to working for the farm workers union as a mother of 11 children, and often having to remind Chavez and others in the leadership of the union that she had those responsibilities as well. And in particular, she often had to advocate for herself from the union to get funds from them so that she could be able to feed her children. right? She eventually becomes, as she retires from the union or leaves the union, she becomes founder and president of the Dolores Huerta Foundation. She travels across the country engaging in campaigns and influencing legislation, so she's still very active. And in 2012 was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by President Obama. Now, as we saw in the reading, both Luisa Moreno and Dolores Huerta's life histories, we see how they each approached motherhood in different ways. While Moreno would leave her daughter with other pro-labor families while she traveled during her own activism, Huerta often kept her children with her during meetings and protests. And so this, her role as a mother, the fact that she would bring her children to contract negotiations, to lobbying meetings, and so on, was often an issue that was brought up about her by those who supported her, but also by those who were against her. And so she was very vocal about resisting expectations that fit traditional motherhood roles for herself, right? She, even though, especially with 11 children, there would be, of course, this expectation that she should stay home with her children, that her children should come first. She very much loved her children, wanted to take care of them, but to her, that was not contrary or in opposition to her role as an activist. People have also talked about her quote unquote emotional excess as a strategy she used in meetings. She didn't separate her role as a mother from being an activist in a contract negotiation. And so often you see her, whether in meetings or in rallies, protests, and so on, where she's speaking, where she is very emotional, right? Or what people would call emotional, right? People would, especially when it comes to gender, women's expression of emotion is often considered hysterical, over the top, and so on. And so often what women have done in order to be perceived as professional and taken seriously is that they tend to sort of check their emotions, right? They don't express or demonstrate the emotions that they're feeling in any particular moment because they don't want to be dismissed, right, by their male colleagues. Well, she did not care, right? She used her emotions, she expressed them, she expressed particularly anger and frustration, especially during contract negotiations. And so she didn't really care. If anything, she used that emotion to her benefit, particularly using the rhetoric of the family in her favor to garner support from farm workers, right? She kind of tapped into the emotions that farm workers had around supporting your family, right? Family as community and so on, as a way to recruit farm workers into the cause, but also to speak for them. And so this quote here is from one particular white man who described her in this particular kind of way as a result of this, emotional excess that she doesn't hold back. Dolores Huerta is crazy. She's a violent woman, where women, especially Mexican American women, are usually peaceful and pleasant. So, right, it says a lot about this person's perception of Mexican American women in general, but also it says a lot about the kind of woman that she was, or is still to this day. Finally, we have Alicia Escalante, who was born in Texas in 1933 and grew up living in poverty with her mother in California. As an adult, she ends up herself being a single mother living in poverty with 5 children and ends up needing to rely on welfare and welfare services to support herself and her children. But as a result of that experience, seeing how women were treated by welfare offices, social workers, and so on, and inspired her to create the East Los Angeles Chicana Welfare Rights Organization in 1967, which dedicated itself to advocating for the rights of welfare recipients, including English translation of welfare documents, child care, and job training. Her organization and Alicia Escalante herself was also very involved and present in a number of different campaigns and movements of this time period. For instance, she organized single mothers with their children to attend the Poor People's Campaign in 1968 in Washington, D.C. She also participated in the Crusade for Justice here in Denver, and there are images of her being present at meetings and parades and campaigns here in Denver as well. So she was very much active and worked in solidarity with many of the other Chicano movements, poor people's movements, welfare rights movements, civil rights movements of this time period. And so one of the reasons that I like to highlight her and always include her in my courses is because she works as a counter narrative to the popular negative images we have of women on welfare. Women on welfare are either invisible to the rest of us or are depicted in negative ways, right? We have the image of the welfare queen. There are these images of women on welfare, first of all, as all of them being women of color, which is not true when you look at the statistics. The vast majority of women who are on welfare in this country are actually white women. But they also then become invisible, right? Then we continue to perpetuate the image that white women are middle class and women of color are poor. But we also tend to think of women on welfare as dependents who are there to mooch off of the government, who are just burdens to society. And so seeing this woman who was on welfare herself, who was a quote unquote welfare mother herself, who was an activist, right, who used her time not just to take care of her children and to mother her children, but to also organize other women like herself, other mothers like herself, who are and were at the time at the very bottom of the barrel, so to speak, really sort of gives us a very different picture, right, of women on welfare, that women on welfare can be activists, can be leaders, right, have other skill sets, and that are contributing members of society. So this ends our lecture for this week. I look forward to hearing your thoughts about these three women in our discussion post. I'll see you next time. Have a wonderful week.